Well, what a thrill to be here, and thank you so much for that introduction. I'm glad you did the short version. Much appreciated. I have so many titles, it's ridiculous. I am thrilled to be here to speak to you about exactly these ideas of trade-offs, and I'm so grateful to Lars for having introduced it the way he did, because it tees up so many of the themes that I'm going to be talking about. But mostly what I want to say is that I'm very grateful to be here on my favorite day of the year. And I don't have very good Swedish, but it is Cinnamon Bun Day. I try to time my visits for Cinnamon Bun Day. I've already had one, but one may not be enough. In any case, I'm very excited to talk about some of these ideas, and I'm going to particularly focus on this notion of trade-offs and whether or not we need to be defeatist about them. And, Lars was saying, well, maybe are there some moments when the trade-offs are real and we can't overcome them? And I want to talk about some ideas about how we might deal with that as well. So what might be on your mind? There's all sorts of complications, and Lars highlighted some of these as well, in addition to the populism, the ESG backlash in the United States, and how is that going to, since so much of what happens in the US, when they sneeze, everyone else gets a cold, how much of that is going to leak over here? Does greater attention to purpose and responsibility create a competitive advantage or a competitive disadvantage? There's so much concern about, can we compete with China and other things? Is disclosure compliance too costly? I've been hearing about the CSRD and the many lines of the Excel spreadsheet that you have to fill out for that. Are there trade-offs between energy security, climate change, employment, and so on? So these are the kinds of things, the kinds of trade-offs that Lars was alluding to, the kinds of things that might be on your mind as important issues to address that, make it harder to do than just saying, yes, let's deal with climate or let's deal with inequality in society. And the reason that these these trade-offs actually occur is because every organization is surrounded by a different set, many sets of different stakeholders, not just the shareholders, but of course, customers, consumers, communities, employees, unions, suppliers, supply chain, environmental issues, activist groups, governments. And so each one of those different groups comes with its own interests and its own demands and its own set of trade-offs and things that they're focused on. And so that creates a lot of pressure on every organization to try to figure out, well, how do we deal with all of these interests? Now, of course, I show you a picture of Milton Friedman here because his dictum that there's only one social responsibility, and that's to make profits, it was a little bit more nuanced than that, but it got adopted, certainly in the US and in many other places, certainly in Canada where I live now, as this idea that you cannot think about any other aspect of social responsibility unless there's a bottom line to it. And that really it's all about profits, and then that got interpreted as it's all about the shareholder, and so then everyone got fixated on stock price and quarterly, reporting. And so that has led us into a world in which, there is climate change is real, and which inequality is growing and all sorts of challenges. And so the question is, how are we going to cope with and deal with these concerns if our framework is the Milton Friedman framework? So it turns out that more and more organizations are starting to think about how they're going to cope with this. And here's a quote from Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock. They manage more than $1 trillion. And so we're saying the investors, those shareholders that supposedly we're supposed to be paying attention to, are saying what we do has to benefit all stakeholders, including shareholders. Now, of course, because of ESG backlash, there's been a little walking back of that statement, but nonetheless, investors are starting to pay attention. And one of the reasons they're paying attention is because they're realizing that these concerns are actually material to the performance of organizations. And then you see, for example, in 2019, the Business Roundtable in the US, which is the group of the CEOs of the largest companies, they signed a statement. They had always had this sort of shareholder primacy kind of goal. They signed a statement repudiating shareholder primacy and saying, you know, we have to have a fundamental commitment to all stakeholders. And so we have investors and CEOs all coming together and saying, we need to think differently about this, given the challenges of the 21st century. But thinking differently about this, that's one thing to say this nice statement up here. There's been a lot of research to show that these companies didn't actually even incorporate, they didn't get this approved by the board, they haven't incorporated in what they're doing. Is this greenwashing or pinkwashing or purpose washing or all of those other kinds of things? So where do we go from here? So the first thing is to figure out who counts as a stakeholder. And I'll just give you one, example. My phone here, which is keeping time so that I don't run over my 30 minutes. Okay, here's an iPhone. I couldn't live without it. Most of us can't live without our devices. You can't even pay for anything in Sweden if you don't have it. So I come from a country that still has cash, but life cycle analysis would tell you all sorts of things. You have to worry about child labor for the people who are mining the minerals that go into the phone. Workers in China who historically were exposed to chemicals to make that screen very shiny, but turns out cause cancer. There's a lot of concerns about women because in the beginning, Siri, who you just shout to Siri to tell her to do things, was a woman's voice. So why are we shouting at women to tell them to do things? Or the health app that didn't think about women, like periods and women's cycles and things like that. So that's a dearth of women engineers, women in STEM, people working in that setting. Communities, the disposal of these things as we upgrade what happens to the old phones, and consumers who have to pay thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of kroner for their new phone every time they want to get a new iPhone. So any device, any product that you make has embedded in it all of these different stakeholders that can create these trade-offs. And so that's the challenge that organizations are going to have to face. If you want to come in, feel free to, for those of you hiding in the back outside. And even if you think about the Sustainable Development Goals, I mean, these are all very laudable, and we all talk about how important these Sustainable Development Goals are, but even they create conflicts among themselves. For example, we may want to have affordable clean energy, which is number 7, but that might conflict with number 14, life below water. For example, the wind turbines off the bay in Massachusetts are interfering with the whale migrations and things like that. So how do we cope with that? Or we might want to have climate action, but there's a concern that that might compromise, which is number 13, might compromise number 8, which is decent work and prosperity. And so even within these social goals, there are conflicts across them. And so it's no wonder that people are sort of asking the how question. And one answer to the how is a lot of regulation, but another answer to the how is what can organizations actually do? And that's my focus. I come at this with a deep empathy for the actual human beings in organizations trying to get things done. So that's what I hope to be sharing a little bit of with you today. And so, when you look at the 360 degrees, hence the 360 Corporation, everything that's surrounding the organization, you have to worry about labor conditions in the supply chain, for example, for fast fashion. You have to worry about the economics of battery production. And let's just say I read a little bit of news about Sweden when I picked these particular topics. You could worry about immigration and agricultural workers. You could be worried about green steel. You could worry about the trade-offs between forestry and biodiversity. These are all these kinds of trade-offs that are important on the agenda and have to be dealt with and resolved. We can't put our head in the sand. So when we talk about trade-offs, this is what we're talking about. The conflicting interests. It's not just some other stakeholder and the bottom line, but even trade-offs across stakeholders. And this is what makes it so challenging, these conflicting interests. So let me give you an example of a way that organizations don't always know what trade-offs they're making. And one of my key messages is you have to think about the ways that they are embedded in your products and services. So this is a picture of the Tazreen factory in Bangladesh in 2013. Most of you will know about that terrible fire where so many people died. And it obviously made news around the world. It made news in Canada. And in the Globe and Mail, which is our leading newspaper, a person wrote an editorial where the headline was, "I designed that cheap garment, I lit that factory fire in Bangladesh." And in that he said, "I've never been to Bangladesh. I did not actually light that fire. But because I work for a major retailer that wants to sell a t-shirt for $15, 150 kroner, I designed that. It meets the needs of consumers, and particularly consumers who don't have a lot of resources. So that's one stakeholder who's being satisfied. But by designing that shirt, I was creating the conditions under which this fire was going to take place. And it was that aha. He quit his job after this because he had that aha moment. I cannot participate in a system that creates the conditions under which these factories are forced to cut corners and things like that. But when you are designing the t-shirt, you may not think to yourself, or when you use your phone, you may not think to yourself, this is creating, just having this product embedded in it are all of these trade-offs. And so one of the most important things that I think organizations can do is be honest with themselves about what trade-offs are embedded in their business model, in their product design, in the assumptions about this is the way things are done around here. So that's the first step, is just sort of knowing what the trade-offs are. And then when you wake up to those trade-offs, there's a lot of things that you can do. And one of the lessons, the ideas that's been out there is this idea of shared value. And that, somehow we're going to be able to create these win-wins. And I think you heard from my thesis supervisor, Rebecca Henderson, last year, whose wonderful book on reimagining capitalism really doubles down on this idea of the win-win, the shared value, that these things are going to be possible. And I'll give you an example of that because it really is embedded in these the business case for sustainability, for diversity, whatever it is. And many people feel the pressure to make that business case. So you hear it all the time. That's kind of the language of it. This creating shared value is kind of like, show me the net present value, show me the spreadsheet that justifies why I should take this step. And many people have found this very motivating, this idea of shared value, because it can inspire people to look at solutions. But I also want to problematize this idea of shared value and encourage us to think a little differently about it in terms of innovation, and I'll get to that in a minute. But let me give you an example of the shared value. So Walmart is a company that I study very closely, and they came under fire for not being very good around issues around women's equality, both in their stores and in their leadership, but also throughout their supply chain. And so because of that pressure, they engaged in a whole big effort on women's economic empowerment in the supply chain that was all about increasing sourcing from women-owned businesses, empowering women around the world to create new businesses, and promoting diversity and inclusion in their supplier base. And, they did a whole bunch of things to make this happen, and I call it beyond the business case, because when they started, they set a $20 billion target for sourcing from women-owned businesses. But to do that, they realized they were going to have to introduce new financing models to help finance these businesses, new models for finding and supporting the women, because in the beginning, they're like, where are the women? We're right here. But where are the women? Couldn't find them, but then they found them. They gave a whole bunch of grants to training more than 1 million women, and then they realized it wasn't enough to train the women. They had to train the men in the communities as well to support the women entrepreneurs. And they did all of this, and what they discovered, according to their chief sustainability officer, is that they found that the products from the women-owned businesses actually had better sell-through rates and better margins, the things that retailers really care about. So in the end, they got that shared value. They didn't maybe know exactly how it was going to work out in the beginning, but what motivated them was this search for the shared value. And it's a great story of a lot of investment on their part to create new ways of supporting women-owned businesses. But let's say that the shared value isn't always there. That is the big challenge. We come back to the example of the Tazreen fire. So Nike, which is another company that I study, they don't manufacture in Bangladesh, in part because they're too worried about all of the manufacturing concerns, but they manufacture in a lot of other places that also have challenges of the same kind. And what Mark Parker, who was the CEO at the time, said is, ignorance is not bliss. You have to understand these issues and work with factory partners to solve them. So he is saying we really have to deeply understand what's going on. And then once they realized that the factories had too much overtime, had dangerous working conditions and things like that, they said, well, what can we do? One solution is to tell the factories, you have to have all these fire exits. You have to have no overtime. You have to do these things. And they realized that that compliance mentality was never going to work. And what they needed to do was a whole series of innovative solutions. So they redesigned their product ordering system so that it created less stress on the factories to do overtime and last-minute production. They rethought the design process at headquarters. So, for example, they used to think that they needed different color schemes and patterns for every country in the world because every country is so different, and then they realized that creates so much pressure on manufacturing to have all these different SKUs, these different lines for products. So they've simplified that. And they reevaluated the factory management practices to realize what they need to do is collaborate with the factory managers to help them learn ways of managing their teams that didn't create these kinds of systems. And so they innovated, they're trying to solve a problem in Vietnam, but they changed how they did product design in Beaverton, Oregon. So they rethought the whole business model. They innovated in the whole business model, and that has led, again, Walmart is not perfect. Nike is not perfect, but it's getting, it's helping to improve things. Is this me making all the mic noise? If so, I apologize. Let me give you another innovation example, and this is about sustainability. And you might be asking, why am I showing a picture of Michael Jordan, one of the greatest basketball players of all time, when I want to talk about sustainability? And here's why. You can see he's wearing number 23. That's his number, and you know that his shoe, the Air Jordan, is one of the most successful footwear franchises, sports franchises in the world, in the history of sports and in the history of footwear. And so every year he has another Air Jordan. And the 23rd year, in 2008, he was going to have Air Jordan 23. So clearly this is a product that's going to matter tremendously to him. And Nike is, really focused on performance. These can't just be beautiful shoes. They have to perform well. But they also wanted it to be sustainable. They wanted it to follow many of the principles that would allow for better use of materials and more sustainability. And here's the product that they got, the Air Jordan. It's a pretty beautiful shoe. And there's so many innovations in this shoe to make it more sustainable. So first of all, more stitching included instead of glue to avoid all those solvents. They had to invent a 3D stitching machine in order to do this. They cut out jigsaw pieces of the outsole and midsole and other parts of the shoe so there was less waste of materials. They used water-based bonding where they needed glue. They had environmentally preferred materials, including recycled materials. This is a beautiful shoe. It performed. Michael Jordan was happy with it, number one most important thing, and it met these principles. But they didn't just magically come up with this in one day. In fact, here's where Nike started. Does not look like the Air Jordan. This is called the Nike Considered Boot. Some people called it the Air Hobbit. It's not the most attractive. It doesn't look like Nike, but nonetheless, in 2005, they started this considered approach to more environmental sustainability, and they designed this shoe that reduced manufacturing waste, reduced energy consumption, reduced use of solvents. It won all sorts of sustainable design awards, and it sold almost no shoes because it's unclear how many people, that's not the Air Jordan. But that was 2005. It turns out, actually, that most of those things that they did for the Air Hobbit ended up in Air Jordan 23. The stitching, the jigsaw cutout, the reduced use of solvents, all of these things. But if they had done this and then asked for the business case, they would have given up. But they kept at it, they kept investing, and they ended up with this massively best-selling shoe that Michael Jordan would approve of. So again, just to problematize the business case, sometimes you just don't know for a while, and what you need to do is innovate, not just, I need to add stitching, I need to invent a whole new machine that will do 3D stitching. These are the kinds of things that they did to produce this product. So again, experimentation, innovation, you have to create space for the experimentation to be able to get to these innovations. And if you asked for the spreadsheet and the PowerPoint presentation on whether this was going to have the business case financially viable, you might not have ever gotten to the Air Jordan 23. So that's kind of a different and new way of thinking about how do we deal with these trade-offs. Well, we don't deal with them like this. In one quarter, we're going to have all the solutions. Sometimes it requires sustained investment, sustained attention, and really innovative, creative thinking. And a lot of times people put the sustainability stuff off the side, and then they have your regular R&D and innovation and product design team. And I'm like, no, this all has to be all in one place, because that's how you get the Air Jordan 23. Let me give you another example, because this is not all about consumer products. So cement, you think is not so interesting, but once you start studying cement, it is really interesting. And one of the things you learn is that cement production around the world accounts for 8% of all CO2 in the environment. Because in order to make cement, you have to heat up limestone to like 1,500 Celsius. So here's a challenge. It's a massive amount of our CO2 emissions, and yet we need cement for everything, every kind of building and sidewalk and things like that. So what are we going to do? How could we innovate? So let me give you a couple different examples. This is a building that's being built right now on the University of Toronto campus. I can see it out of my window every day. I watch as it's being built. It is called the unimaginatively academic wood tower. I assume someone will give money and it'll be called something else eventually, but right now it is called the academic wood tower. It is a wood tower. And it is, when we first designed it, it was going to be the tallest wood tower in North America, but it takes a while, so now that we're going to be one of the tallest wood towers in North America. It's going to be 14 stories high and built with almost no cement, built with cross-laminated timber instead. And this is a solution that is going to radically reduce, if this gets used more frequently, radically reduce the use of cement, which is a major CO2 emitter. On the other hand, it uses more wood. Another trade-off, very complicated. But nonetheless, net, the net effect of building buildings like this is that it reduces CO2 in the environment. And so this is one example. You could say, we don't need cement. We're going to substitute. We're going to get rid of cement. But here's another innovative example, a Canadian company. I'm a proud Canadian. Well, I'm American originally, but now I'm Canadian and very happy to be Canadian these days. Another innovative company, Carbon Cure. They, instead of getting rid of cement, they're actually trying to use cement to embed carbon inside of it. And in fact, the process of embedding, sequestering the carbon in the cement, makes the cement stronger and more effective in the applications. And so this is a net reducer of carbon. It's still cement, but it's just a very different kind of cement. So this is a startup. And one of the things that I think both of these stories of the cross-laminated timber and these stories of Carbon Cure and other ways of thinking about cement, there's so many innovative startup opportunities. This is something large companies should be thinking about, but it's also, when we talk about the innovation ecosystem, it doesn't just need to be apps in Silicon Valley. There's so many different innovative opportunities, and CarbonCure is one of them. Interestingly enough, what do they say? This is cut from their webpage itself. They call themselves a win-win solution. But it's win-win over the longer term because the time it's taken, the years and the investment to even prove that this technology will work are substantial. And so, again, while I do believe in the win-win, I think we get to the win-win later. If we start with a demand for a very clear-eyed view of the win-win, we may never get to the other place. We may get stuck in incremental thinking. We may get stuck in the current ways of doing business. And so this is an alternative way of thinking about the challenges. So just a few more slides with some concluding thoughts about what this might mean. I thought I only have 4.5 minutes, so you're giving me 10. I can just opine up here now. So 4 mistakes that I think organizations make when they think about how to deal with these trade-offs. So the first is not even knowing what your trade-offs are. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. We don't often even we don't look into the assumptions of the way things are done around here. So understanding the impacts and collaborating with stakeholders to do so is for sure an important starting point. The second, as I said, is starting with the business case. Big mistake in my view. It'll be there, but if you limit your ideas to what is profitable right now, you probably won't get to deal with at least the really tough. You'll get to the low-hanging fruit. You'll get Walmart, one of the things they did is they said, why are we shipping laundry detergent in these huge containers filled with water? We're going to force all of our suppliers to have concentrated laundry detergent. And then that'll give us more shelf space for other things. It'll reduce transportation costs. It'll reduce the use of plastic. It was like a win-win-win. Everyone was winning. Even that was super tough to make happen, but that's the low-hanging fruit. You can do those things with the business case mindset first, but you can't do it for any of these tougher challenges that we've been talking about. The third is to treat social responsibility as an add-on. How many people have I talked to who say, I have my day job, and then I'm also supposed to do social responsibility? The thing that's on the side of the desk is not the thing that's going to get done. It's not the thing that's going to get prioritized. So one of the things that I talk about is seeing social responsibility not as an extra thing I have to do or an extra complication of my job, but actually a source of innovation, a source of transformation, the tension that gives us that creative spark. So I really feel like this idea that we've tried to just layer this on top of the business as opposed to using it to transform the business is really a big challenge. And then finally, giving up if you can't find a solution. These problems are hard. No, now I'm down to 2. She went from 10 to 2 in like 1 minute, so just so you know, I'm getting some conflicting information here. That more aligns with my slides, my timer. Giving up if you can't find a solution. These problems are hard, and so I really want to encourage everyone to find ways to experiment, to find ways to not give up, to at least try something, because I think that's how we're going to get, that got all the phones up, that's good. Find ways to experiment. And I really believe, and we saw this through COVID, that the most socially responsible firms were the ones that were the most resilient through that crisis, but that's one of like 2,500 crises we're going to face in this century. And so building in these capacities, I think, makes organizations more resilient. So I'll say a first step is getting to know what's going on. And I think a lot of you who are in organizations are struggling with all of the reporting that you're required to do. And this slide is simply an invitation to you to treat the reporting as an opportunity to learn about yourself, to learn about the trade-offs. If you have that learning mindset and then you engage with the stakeholders, you are much more likely to come up with these solutions. And so I put this here to say I have deep empathy for everyone in organizations having to do all of this compliance, and I just want you to turn compliance into a learning opportunity. How can we use this stuff we're producing externally to learn about ourselves internally? And so in conclusion, I encourage all of you to be 360 leaders, to ask the questions, to co-create with your stakeholders, to use all these creative frictions for ideas, to, most importantly, maybe being willing to let go of how we do things around here, to use the innovative talent in your organization, to avoid seeing stakeholders as an add-on, to learn as you go, and then, of course, don't be paralyzed. It's easy to be paralyzed in the face of these challenges, and I just invite you all to get started. Thank you very much.